resend it. But what I can tell you from what I know of working with Rep. Rubio is we had met through the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, because people there very much celebrate her work. And, she was the one that brought this an idea to us. This group has really been taking on the issues of outdoor recreation and how that influences public lands management. So she has been a leader in that group and sharing her work.
I'm really honored to have been invited to participate in today's conversation. Again, my name is Angelica Rubio. I serve in the New Mexico State Legislature. I represent District 35 here in New Mexico, which encompasses the second largest city in New Mexico, and in my opinion, the best city, which is Las Cruces. I represent a very diverse community that not only neighbors the city of El Paso here in just south of us in Texas, but it also neighbors Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, in the country, in Mexico. And so I am a fronteriza through and through, and that just means I'm from the border with generations of family living along the U.S.-Mexico border, which is probably one of the most unique, diverse, and familial regions in the world, despite what some might say. As someone who was born and raised along the border, I also have a very deep connection and relationship to the land and its people. With that said, in 2019, I co-sponsored legislation to create the New Mexico Outdoor Recreation Division, a division under the New Mexico Economic Development Department. But the most innovative piece about this legislation was the vision around Outdoor Equity Fund, which just last month announced the inaugural award recipients, and it is the first of the kind in the country, and it was created to allow youth equitable access to the outdoors. The grant will support transformative outdoor experiences that foster stewardship and respect for New Mexico's land and water, and its cultural heritage. But the Outdoor Equity Fund is one of my proudest achievements so far, and my hope is that it won't be the last. But if you look at the stats and rankings, New Mexico's children don't get the best out there in comparison to those living in other parts of the country. In fact, our New Mexican children rank very low when it comes to access to quality education, access to quality healthcare, and overall quality of life. And so access to the outdoors is an absolutely incredible tool to ensure that all of these areas improve over time. And that was my commitment to the work. And that was what we have been really centered on over the course of the last year and a half. As I mentioned last month, the Outdoor Equity Fund awarded a total of $261,863 toward getting approximately 2,700 kids from New Mexico outside over the next year. A total of 84 incredible applications were submitted for the inaugural Outdoor Equity Fund grant cycle. And these applications came from tribes, pueblos, municipalities, counties, and nonprofits who applied by developing so many creative ideas to introduce young New Mexicans to the state's lands and water, especially in the time of COVID, and trying to figure out the best ways to do that over the course of the next year. And some of the groups that were awarded were one here locally in Las Cruces. They're called Families and Youth Incorporated, and they called their project the Outdoor Legacy Project. And what this project will provide are resources and support to educate youth on conservation, climate, and cultural connectedness to the outdoors. And it seeks to empower youth by providing innovative, quality outdoor experiences that promote having a sense of ownership, relationship, and responsibility with regards to our lands and natural resources. Another one that I was really excited about was Caruna Colectiva, which means work, learn, earn, which is a work, learn, earn environment for Indigenous youth to enhance the autonomy, creative skills, health, and success through holistic practices and traditional culture. Their program aims to connect Indigenous youth back to the water by taking bike rides along the bosque trails and learning about the vital necessity of natural environments that are rooted in cultural identities, especially here in New Mexico, where we're such a multicultural state. And lastly, another award was to the New Mexico Dream Team, and this was for outdoor undocu-healing. For those of you who don't know, I am also most of my work I came to be through immigrant advocacy and my activism, because my parents are both from Mexico. And so a lot of my work is related to immigration. And so this group specifically is related to addressing issues for undocumented people. This is the outdoor undocu healing program, which empowers immigrant youth and other students of color to grapple with larger questions of place, identity, history, and belonging during a 4-weekend backpacking retreat in northern New Mexico's Carson National Forest. And it'll support multi-generational, undocumented LGBTQ and mixed status families with the focus on social justice and therapeutic discussion, and also climate change and the ways that environmental crises often hit communities of color the hardest. For this upcoming legislative session in January, we're looking for creative ways to also increase funding for outdoor equity funds so that we can provide access to an overall vision of getting 30,000 kids in New Mexico outside. And some of these ideas include tapping into a percentage of revenues coming from recreational marijuana sales that we hope will pass statewide during the upcoming session.
Yeah, Angelica, thank you for taking time from the campaign trail. I would appreciate, I think it would be a nice springboard into the conversation that's about to follow. If you could share with us what some of the obstacles you faced in winning passage of that bill were, and the strategies or the messaging that you used to overcome those.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because when so it was so this to be honest and frank, this whole idea around outdoor equity fund took shape at a local bar with between myself and one of my good friends who's a huge outdoorsman, and we wrote all of these ideas on a napkin, and we've just been so passionate about how do we bring young people into this conversation, especially from an equity lens. And so before we even approached the sponsor who was leading the efforts to create the Division of Outdoor Recreation, we reached out to a coalition of over 30 organizations that included environmental and conservation groups, but also immigrant rights organizations, LGBTQ organizations. And so this coalition of over 30 organizations signed on to a letter right around the time that the governor won her election and was moving towards a transition. She was starting to build her transition team, that we reached out and we said, if you are going to champion the creation of the Division of Outdoor Recreation, we will not support we will not support the creation of the division without including the Outdoor Equity Fund. Needless to say, that was not something that the sponsor of the bill was happy about, and so it required a lot of negotiating to not only get the legislation in the language because he wanted it completely separate, but to also get buy-in on the fact that it needed to be someone like myself and one of my colleagues representing Navajo Nation, that it was incredible. It was necessary for it to be led by women of color. Folks didn't really appreciate that it was written in the language of like memorials. They didn't really appreciate the fact that we were trying to give space for Native and Indigenous people, and how this was going to be centered on a lot of our past and how our history really is very complex here in the state of New Mexico when we talk about issues related to colonization and displacement, and then now wanting to build an outdoor economy on this land. So Republican support was incredible in the sense that I think that they really appreciated what this, not necessarily talking about it from a race perspective, but just from a generational perspective, and how are we supporting another generation of stewards of our land to really protect the land for future generations. I think was a huge success in terms of the way that we were able to work with folks on the other side of the aisle. And of course, just the idea of getting young people outside, I think was just an incredible opportunity, especially because we have such a rural and isolated, we are a rural and isolated state. And so that this wasn't just an urban idea, that this was actually going to help support so many communities across the state. And so that made it out of the House. It went up to the governor, and she signed it, and that's it. And here we are.
Geran, would you like to share some of your thoughts when you think about the Equity Fund in Alaska and the conversations you've had with Angelica about how that might work here?
Well, thank you. And first, again, and for example, I represent the lowest income urban district in the state. Equity is a huge issue. And, you know, we love Alaska for all this access to outdoor activities that very few of the kids that I represent get to do. That's just it. I know Beth Nordland from the Park Foundation is on. You know, thankfully there's programs that try to get some of our kids out. And
I mean, I think that's probably the most critical piece for why we were so successful in passing this legislation, especially because of where we are now. In not only with COVID and how COVID has unveiled all these inequities that many in our communities are experiencing, but the summer of reckoning that we've had with race in this country, and that we were lucky enough to have had this conversation over the course of the last 2 years when it comes to just access to the outdoors. And part of the reason why I think that our legislation was able to be so successful is because one, we had a really understanding administration that came in that was really interested in some really not only just cutting edge policy, but also intentional in terms around how are we going to address a number of policy issues that are intersectional, because it's not just about this siloed focus on outdoors, or the siloed focus on health, or the siloed focus on economic development, but it's really how we look at all of these issues in a way that they intersect so many of our communities. And so I think that as an organizer myself, as a community organizer, one of the principles that I really try to look for in everything that I do legislatively is meeting people where they're at. And this was one of those places where this really led me to be centered on the lives of the people that it would be directly impacting, but also how do I bring not only my allies with me, but even perhaps people who didn't really understand what we were trying to do, to not leave them behind either, but to bring them with us. Because while we may not agree philosophically on, let's say, addressing disparities in health or whatever, for many, economic development was a big deal. And so this was one way to center around that.
And I have a question too. Are there how politically active or like that connection you had with the Navajo? You went out and reached out to them, or they heard it percolating out and came to you. How did you forge that relationship to get that tribe involved in advocating for this?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because historically here in the state of New Mexico, what politicians have done is they consult with Native and Indigenous people, and then that's it. Like, I think for myself and my friend, Councilman, he's a councilman actually, Gabe Vasquez here in Las Cruces, because of the work that we have been doing in social justice circles, even before we were elected officials, we already had established relationships with people all across the state through all of our work. And so when this opportunity came to be, it was just a matter of really forging those relationships and making sure that that ideas that were coming, that were starting to percolate, were really centered in their experiences. Because again, like, this issue around creating an economy on outdoor recreation when we are on the land of the people in which we're colonized in our state, it's a very complicated conversation to have. And so I think that is the reason why the Outdoor Equity Fund, not that it solves everything, hundreds and thousands of years of injustices, but it at least brings us to a place where we can begin to sort of create a different way of how we work with each other, because it's again, it's when you have a state government that was built on a lot of these historical injustices, and then still trying to forge relationships with tribal communities, there's a lot of effort needs to be made, where it's not just about consulting, but it's also about that whole idea of not leaving people where meeting people where they're at. Like, if the legislation is not ready for this year because those relationships haven't been forged, then it's worth it. And I think that was the challenges that we had to overcome, especially with some of our progressive allies, is that they wanted to win this issue so badly. But at the same time, we had to also say, like, pump the brakes, because if the right people are not at the center of this work, if the right people are not at the table, then there's no point in passing this legislation.